Picture the scene. You're racing at Spa in Belgium. And I'm not on about the current modern Spa, I'm talking the Spa of yesteryear. The Spa that was 8 miles long and entirely on public roads. It's absolutely lashing it down, and in the space of mere seconds you're flipping over, coming to a stop, broken a few bones, and there's petrol soaking your skin, clothes and face. Now luckily for you, 2 of your mates have also crashed out and have come over to see that you're okay, and you get to live into your golden years while most of your friends weren't so lucky. I mean, check out this list of drivers. And this probably isn't all of them, but they're all friends and or contemporaries of Sir Jackie Stewart, the driver who was in that hypothetical situation that wasn't actually a hypothetical situation, it actually happened. You've got Bruce McLaren, killed at Goodwood testing a sports car in 1970. Jim Clark, killed in 1968 at Hockenheim driving in Formula 2. You've got Ken Miles, killed testing a Ford GT. Graham Hill, involved in a plane crash outside of London in 1975. Francois Sever, killed at Watkins Glen in 1973. Lorenzo Bandini at Monaco in 1967. Spence, Schlesser, Scarfiotti, Rindt, Bonnier, Courage. The feeling of the time was twofold. You had organisers and circuit owners saying, if you don't like it, fuck off and play chess if you're that bothered because motorsport is dangerous. Deal with it. And the other was, it'll happen to somebody else. The problem was, and I'm not saying these drivers had that attitude, is that Schlesser, Bandini, McLaren, Miles, they were somebody else's somebody else. And it wasn't until Jim Clark was killed in 1968 that the drivers realised that Jackie had a point. They all thought Jim Clark was too good to die in a racing accident. And if Jim Clark could die in a racing car, then the chances of them dying in a racing car was very real. And very high. And it's incredible to see how many of Sir Jackie Stewart's contemporaries didn't make it compared to those who did. As that list earlier makes out, if they didn't die in motor racing accidents, they might have met their end doing other activities. It was quite telling of a time when sex was safe and racing was dangerous. It was a time of huge advancements in the areas of transport, science, technology, and even weapons development. F-4 Phantoms in Vietnam with their brand new Sidewinder heat-seeking missiles, the space race, the British, the French and the Russians getting supersonic jet aircraft into service. The Boeing 747 was flying by the end of the decade, and racing cars reaching speeds of 200 miles an hour. To fly an experimental supersonic jet-powered aircraft, escape the atmosphere with a rocket strapped to your ass, or even do 200 miles an hour in a bathtub with wheels, you had to be brave, crazy, or both. During the 1960s, engineering went absolutely bananas. It was after this absolutely horrendous shunt that Jackie Stewart decided something had to change, and that the circuits had to change along with the cars. Now naturally, the circuit owners didn't like this because, well, they're business owners. And business owners don't like spending a penny more than they can absolutely get away with. If you don't like it, slow down was the main clapback, and at the start, drivers were thinking the same thing. We don't want to wear seatbelts because, well, what if we're trapped in a burning car? Jackie X and Pedro Rodriguez were 2 mavericks that wouldn't have been friends with the Scot on Facebook, but X would later change his tune by 1969. And this is the year that the story begins, because over the course of 12 months, Formula 1 did the unthinkable, in inverted commas, and boycotted the 8-mile Spa and also the Nurburgring. The Grand Prix Drivers Association had existed since 1961, originally headed up by Stirling Moss. When Moss retired in 1963, Joe Bonnier took over, and while Stewart wasn't the director, he was certainly quite vocal, advocating for the use of seatbelts and full-face helmets to improve driver safety. It made him unpopular to start with, but eventually more and more rallied to the cause. Drivers such as John Surtees, Graham Hill and Jack Brabham were the more senior members, and when Jackie started his safety crusade, he was very effective at rallying the drivers together and pushing back against increasingly hard to work with circuit owners. By 1969, wings had sprouted on the cars and cornering speeds were increasing, as were the loads on drivers' bodies. Corners that would require lifting or braking were now being taken several miles an hour faster, and the fear was that these super fast cars were going to end up wrapped around telegraph poles or inside houses, or worse still, going into crowds if something went wrong. Spa was one such circuit where these fears were growing. The track was entirely on public roads, and at the terrifyingly fast Master Kink, buildings were on the exit of the corner, and at another corner later on down the route, the apex was someone's driveway. The fences keeping animals in the fields were topped with barbed wire, and the drivers could see the path they'd be taking if they went off the road. René Bovey, the general secretary of the circuit at the time, said in the documentary The Killer Years, "There are people here that were saying that the drivers had to adapt to the track. Stewart said it was the opposite, that circuits must adapt to the mechanical evolution of Formula 1. At the time, I didn't understand him. I thought, what does he want? He wants to change everything here. When I spoke to the board about him, they said he's an idiot. The track owners thought they had more power than the drivers, and the drivers were saying, no, we have the power because without us, you don't have a race. The owners of the Spa circuit thought that the team bosses would order their drivers to race, but they didn't. In most cases, the team owners joined their drivers in saying that it wasn't right. Jack Brabham, Lewis Stanley, Colin Chapman, Ken Tyrrell, Bruce McLaren. In some cases, the drivers were the bosses. And it wasn't just the circuit owners, but also the media that wasn't impressed with Stewart and his mates. Dennis Jenkinson of Motorsport magazine said, I've always thought that one of the enduring features of a Grand Prix driver was that he had the guts and would accept a challenge that normal people like you or I would not be brave enough to face. Now I'm not so sure. Jenkinson accused Stewart of milk and water thinking, and saying that the drivers were putting money before the sport, that they were so overpaid that any obstacle put in the way of future power had to be removed, and pointed out the hypocrisy of the likes of Bonnier and McLaren racing sports cars at Spa and Le Mans that had higher top speeds than anything Lotus or whoever else on the grid could run around that track. Ken Tyrrell had come to Stewart's defence, saying the track was too fast for modern, at the time at least, Formula 1 cars, to which Jenkinson said, I fail to see what speed or danger has to do with Ken Tyrrell, who does all of his operating from the pits. If he managed Stewart's driving from the passenger seat, I would take note of what he said. Funnily enough, it was Jenkinson who branded Stewart a pious little Scot with beady eyes. Because of Spa's unwillingness to make the safety changes due to what the circuit said was time constraints, but the GPDA had been asking for these changes for some time, the GPDA had a vote, and the race did not go ahead at Spa. They just completely wiped it off the calendar. The drivers sent a huge middle finger to a circuit and its bosses that thought that nobody would dare to try such a thing. The drivers were united, the team bosses were largely on their side. They sent a big message. The following year, a chicane had been placed at Malmedy, slowing the cars down significantly, but by 1970 the wings on the cars had advanced further and speeds through the master kink were higher than they'd ever been, which again was pointed out by those who were being a bit boomery about the whole safety thing. The circuit had, however, made more changes beyond that chicane though. Barriers had been added, but the general vibe was still not quite right with the drivers. And it would be the last time that Formula 1 would race on that 8-mile layout. Sports cars would continue to race on it, and Jackie Stewart had tried to get other drivers in other categories to boycott, but the place was too popular with non-F1 drivers. The following year, Formula 1 was coping with the death of Bruce McLaren, killed when his Can-Am car crashed at Goodwood. 3 weeks later, Piers Courage was killed at Zandvoort, and there was also a close call at the Spanish Grand Prix when Jackie Oliver T-boned Jackie Ickx, and the cars erupted in a vicious fireball. The memorial service for McLaren had been held at St Paul's Cathedral in London, after which the Grand Prix Drivers Association got together at the Dorchester Hotel. Jochen Rindt, who would later win that year's championship, albeit posthumously, had been to Germany to speak with the organisers of the Grand Prix, given that he could speak fluent German and hold the ultra-detailed conversations required without anything getting lost in translation. They went over the list of the things that the drivers had requested to be done for the German Grand Prix, and when it turned out that they flat out refused to do anything for it, Jack Brabham, who never really had much to say in these meetings, stood up and said, "We're not going." There was a vote, and they boycotted the Nurburgring as well. Another circuit that assumed that the drivers would toe the line, given that the Nurburgring, like Spa, was it was a driver's track. The ultimate challenge of car and driver, the ultimate show of man and machine, the sort of place that makes people go, wow, these guys are cool. Unlike the drivers had done to the Belgian Grand Prix, they just said no, and they went to Hockenheim instead, which had got crash barriers. The boycotts of Spa and the Nürburgring were significant wins for the drivers' union. Circuit owners across the world were now put in a position of, well, if they can do it to those two tracks, they can do it here, and many tracks made the changes that were being requested. The war, if you want to call it that, would still carry on. In the 1970s, Roger Williamson, Francois Sever, Peter Revson, Helmut Koenig, Mark Donoghue, Tom Price and Ronnie Peterson would all lose their lives in Formula 1 cars. Since 1982, the number of drivers killed in a Formula 1 car is 4. 10 deaths in 1 decade, averages 1 a year, versus 4 in 40 years. De Angelis, Ratzenberger, Senna and Bianchi. That number can become 5 though if you include Maria Di Vallota. But in Jackie's own words, I'd have been a more popular champion if I said what people wanted to hear. I'd be dead, but I'd certainly be more popular. So then, a look at the time the F1 drivers did the unthinkable, in inverted commas. If you've learned something here today, then do like the video for the Al Gore rhythm, and for more stuff like this, get subscribed with the Derek bell on so you never miss out. Big thanks to the kind folk at Patreon for the support, and if you want to help out with keeping things running around here, then there's a link to Patreon in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, and my F1 Store affiliate link. Well, there's super thanks if you just want to buy me a beer. So until next time, I've been Millward. Have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.